Today's daf is Pei Vav, and you may recall that at the beginning of this daf, the Gemara tells a story about Reb Chia. Reb Chia had flax or linen, and it was attacked by moths. So just before we start the Mishnah, we'll finish up with that story about the moths. Umi nafalei. Let's just see where you can find this. There's a line that starts v'liboy kisui, which is about 12 lines down from the top. Umi nafalei yaniva bekisna. Could moths actually attack the flax of Rabbi Chia v'omer of Ravin bar Abba v'amrile omer of Ovid bar Shva misha'olu b'nei hagola. So the people came on Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael from Bavel, and that fits very well into the history of Reb Chia as well. Pasku azikim vazvos varuchos varaomim. When these great tzaddikim came to Eretz Yisrael, there were no longer earthquakes or storms, thunder, wind, meteors that came down from the heavens. Lo hichmetienom, the wine didn't sour. Lo lokapishtan, the flax was not afflicted, meaning by moths. And when the Chachamim tried to figure out which particular tzaddik that came to Eretz Yisrael brought all these brachos, Naslu Chachamim v'Rabbi Chia Bana. They looked at Rabbi Chia and they said, "Oh, he's the righteous Bavloi who came on Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael and caused the end of these afflictions." So if Rabbi Chia brought this bracha to all of Eretz Yisrael when he came to Eretz Yisrael, then obviously he himself, for sure, would not be attacked by, his flax would certainly be protected from these moths. And the Gemara says an unbelievable concept here, that kimahanyas chusayu alma badidhu lo, that sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring about a bracha because of the tzaddik, and yet the tzaddik himself will not receive that bracha. Ki the Rav Yehuda Amarav, the Amarav Chol yom v'yom bas kol yotzeis v'yomeres kol olam kulo nizon b'shvil chanina b'ni. So the Gemara is giving an example from Chanina, the son of Rav, and the whole world will be sustained in the merit of Chanina. That's what Rav declares. But Chanina b'ni, you would think that he would certainly have lavish meals, but rather, dailo b'kav charuv mer Shabbos ev Shabbos. So all he would eat from Friday to Friday was a kav's worth of carobs, of charuvim. We used to call it when we were kids bakser. We used to eat it on Lag BaOmer. And now we start the Mishnah here. Cherei shot v'kotev sheshachatu v'acherim roam osam. So now we have three categories of people who do not have das, they're labnei das, and therefore on their own, if they shecht an animal, in this case we're talking about a chaya or an oaf, if they're on their own, we don't trust and we don't assume that they did a good shechita. In fact, the Gemara is going to raise the possibility that we assume they did a bad shechita. But here they're being supervised by a gadol. That's called gadol acherim roim osam. Otherwise, it's called the gadol omid al gabov. And therefore, since in a case where the gadol omid al gabov, the acherim roim osam can testify that their shechita was a perfectly reliable kosher shechita, they're v'chayv l'chasos. So then that shechita is matir the basar. And once it's matir the basar, then there's an obligation of kisi adam. So that even though lechatchila we would not offer a chereshot v'katan the opportunity to go ahead and do shechita, but b'di'eved, if they did the shechita, and we could somehow clarify that the shechita and determine that the shechita was a valid shechita without any psulei shechita, for example, in the case of acherim roam also, then you're allowed to eat the meat, and therefore it's a valid shechita, and it generates a chiyuv of kisui adam. Now, who actually has to perform the kisui adam? Usually the shochet will perform the kisui adam, but in this case, the Cheres Shot V'Katan who performed the Kisei Adam would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Kisei Adam because they don't have the obligation of Kisei Mitzvah. So that we're going to see in Mitzvah Hashem in the next Mishnah, that the Mishnah is going to say on Daf Pevavam and Beis, that if one person did the Shechita, then somebody else, if the shochet himself did not perform the shechita, then somebody else has to jump up to the, step up to the plate and do the shechita. So there, in this case, let's say the gadol who was omer al gabav, he'll do the kisei adam, or somebody else will do the kisei adam. But if there's no adult that is supervising the shechita, the Cheres Shot V'Katan, then potum ilchasos, which means that the basar is considered nevela, and the shechita was not matir the basar, because we don't assume that the Cheres Shot V'Katan did a proper shechita, and memela it's a shechita sheina re'uya, and it doesn't generate kisei adam. V'chein le'inyan oso v'es beno. Now the Mishnah in the Sefer is going to flip it around and talk about whether you're allowed to shech the offspring of the mother, if the mother was shechted by a Cheres Shot V'Katan. And the answer is that shachatu acherim omrom osam, there's a gadol omen al gava to supervise. And in this case, also lishal achrem, you're not allowed to kill, you're not allowed to shech the offspring on the same day that the katan went ahead and shechted the mother. However, Beino Levein Atzmo, and it's a little bit confusing here because the Beino Levein Atzmo should be a mirror image of what we saw in the ratio with regard to Kisei Adam, and yet in this particular section of the Mishnah, meaning the Sefer, when it gets to the issue of Oso Vespino, the Mishnah presents a machlokes. Beino Levein Atzmo, in the case where the Cheres Shot V'Katan had no supervision, Rabbi Meir Matil Lishchot Achreihem. So again, this is Rabbi Lishitoso, an exact reflection of what we saw in the Reisha with regard to Kisei Adam. Just like in the Reisha, we saw that if there's no one supervising the Cheres Shot V'Katan, Rabbi Meir says that the shechita is assumed to be possible, and therefore, in the case of Beino Levein Atzmo, there was no supervision. Potum ilchasos, there's no chi of kisui. So too, there's no iser of oso vespino, because both of these are interdependent, and it all depends upon whether the shechita was a valid shechita. If there's no valid shechita, there's no kisei adam. If there's no valid shechita, there's no iser of oso vespino. But yet, to our surprise, the Mishnah in the case of Oso Vespino quotes a machlokes tanoim. Rabbi Meir Matil Lishchot Achreihem, according to Rabbi Meir, you could shech the offspring on that very same day because the shechita of the mother was performed by a Cheres Shot V'Katan without anyone supervising it, and therefore it's assumed to be an invalid shechita. But Chacham say you're not allowed to shech the offspring on the same day that the mother was shechted by the Cheres Shot V'Katan without anyone seeing it. And the Gemara later on is going to try to figure out if these Chachamim would argue even in the Reisha. Although in the Reisha, with regard to Kisei Adam, the Rabbanan Shita was not quoted, but perhaps we could say that the Chachamim quoted at the end of the Mishnah are making a statement that goes back even and includes the Reisha, the first case of Kisei Adam, and therefore the Chachamim would say that we have to be machmir and require Kisei Adam, even in a case where the Cheres Shot V'Katan unsupervised perform the shchita. However, the Chachamim, says the Mishnah, modim shem shachat sheino sofik esarboim. Even the Chachamim, who argue that we have to go l'chumra and we're not allowed to shech the mother and the child on the same day, even though the mother was shechted by an unsupervised cheirishot v'katan, and the Chachamim say, you know what? We're not going to allow the shchita of the offspring because maybe the cheirishot v'katan got it right. It's possible. It's plausible. We have no proof one way or the other, and therefore we have to require himanut, avoiding the possible violation of oso vespino, and therefore we have to pray. But if someone went ahead and shechted the child on the same day as the cheirishot v'katan shechted the mother, then he would not get malchus, because we never give malchus in a case of suffix, and here's clearly it's a case of suffix. We're only worried about the outside chance that maybe the cheirishot v'katan actually performed a good shchita. So the Gemara says the following. I don't get it. The Chachamim Shita is only quoted in the Sefer with regard to Oso Vespino. For Abodah Maishno Reisha de Lo Polig Maishno Sefer de Polig. Why do they, through their silence, seem to concede that in the ratio with regard to Kisi Adam, Rabbi Meir is right that if there was no supervision over the Cheirishot v'Katan, we assume that the Shechita was not a good Shechita. They boggled the Shechita, and therefore there's no requirement of Kisi Adam. Why not? If in the case in the Sefer, with regard to Osav Espino, they prohibit, they're worried about the possibility, the chance that maybe the Cheirishot v'Katan performed a perfect Shechita, then if that be the case, then apply that consistently, and that rule would lead you to the conclusion that as far as Kisi Adam, you should require Kisi Adam just in case the Cheirishot v'Katan performed a valid Shechita. So the Gemara is going to approach this from two different vantage points. First, the Gemara is going to say, Reisha, Iyamrin, and Chayav, and Lachasos. Maybe there's a reason why the Chachamim would concede to Rabbi Meir in the case of Kisi Adam that we have to avoid Kisi Adam. Kisi Adam becomes a no-no, and this is Gzeira D'Rabbanan. And this applies even though the Chachamim are afraid lest the Cheirishot v'Katan performed a good Shechita. We're not going to allow Kisi Adam. Why not? Amri Shechita Ba'alisa. Maybe the onlooker would suspect that if they did the Kisi Adam, why did they do that? It must be that the Shechita was a good Shechita. They're going to go ahead and eat from the meat. So Gemara says, wait a minute. If that be the case, then what about also Vespino in the Sefer? Sefer Nami Keved de Ka'amri Rabbanan also Lishchot Achreim Amri Shchita Me'al Yisahi V'Yosel Meichal Shchitasam. Aren't the Rabbanan going to be consistent if they're worried about the misimpression of the onlooker, and they're going to come to the conclusion that since you prohibited shechting the offspring, that is a statement, positive statement, that the shechita of the mother was a valid shechita. And if that be the case, they're going to go ahead and eat the meat from the mother's shechita. So the Gemara says the following. That's not a kash. Seifa amri bisra de lo kami boile. In the case of the Seifa, when they see that there was an inhibition and they did not shech the offspring, they're not going to come to the conclusion that the reason for that is because of the Yisra of Espino. Just simply, there was no need to eat meat. So they didn't shech the meat. They wanted fresh meat tomorrow or a week from tomorrow. And they didn't shech the offspring. The fact that they didn't shech the offspring does not necessarily ipso facto lead to the conclusion that they were machmir, thinking that the first shchita of the mother was a valid shchita. So Gemara says, wait a minute, let's be consistent. Reisha nami amri l'nakir chatzera hu tzarich. If the onlooker in the Reisha sees that they went ahead and they just 1 second. In the Reisha also, there was no supervision on the Shechita, and yet the Chachamim say that that he does not require, like Rabbi Meir, he does not require Kisi Adam. So then the onlooker will say that just 1 second again. Okay. We're holding now. I'm sorry, I just want to make the cheshbon that in that case, the Chachamim concede to Rabbi Meir that what? That that there's no Kisi Adam. So if, again, if there's no Kisi Adam, Kisi Adam, so they're not going to come to eat from the meat. But they'll say L'nakir chatzero hu tzar, that for hygienic reasons he was inhibited from performing Kisi Adam because he's in the process of cleaning out his chotzer. Again, let's just see the logic. The Chachamim in the Sefer did not allow shechting the whatchamacallit, the offspring on the same day. Why? So the Gemara is suggesting because that would seem to indicate that the shechita of the cherishot were cut without supervision was a valid shechita. I'm sorry, just give me a minute. I'm sorry, I just have to make the cheshbon so I make sure I'm on the right track here. The Gemara says that in the case of the Reisha, we're not going to allow kisui because kisui would indicate to the onlooker that this was a valid shechita. They make him to eat the meat. And in the Sefer, they're not going to come to that mistaken conclusion if we prohibit the shechita of the offspring, because people say they just weren't in the mood to shech the animal. So now the Gemara asks, Reisha Nami, in the Reisha, it seems like the Chachamim concede to Rabbi Meir if there was no supervision of the Chesed, then you do not need Kisi Adam. I see. That maybe we should say that what? That if he goes ahead Again, in the Sefer, the Chachamim say that what? That we have to be machmir, but in the rate, right? We have to be machmir, and we're not worried about the onlook. But in the Reisha, the Rabbanan concede to Rabbi Meir, we don't have to be machmir and require kisi adam. In the Reisha, what did Rabbi Meir say in the Reisha? Potur milichasos. And we don't require kisi adam. Right? In the Sefer, we prohibited it, meaning the shechita of the offspring. So why don't the Rabbanan consistently require kisi adam against Rabbi Meir in the Reisha? So you're going to say that if they require kisi adam, then people might come to eat. No. If they require kisi adam, maybe the kisi adam was done in order to observe the hygienic cleanliness of the chutz. Meaning he didn't want to leave dam around his chutzer after the shechita. You don't want to walk into a yard and there's full of blood around. And therefore he went ahead and he cleansed his yard. But he wasn't at all interested in the mitzvah kisi adam. And we have to add another point here, it seems to me, that there was no bracha on the kisi adam, because you can't make a bracha just because you want to be machmir. Maybe he got the shechita right. So again, where are we holding now? Let's make a cheshbon. Now we have a problem. If the Rabbanan machmir in the Sefer to prohibit the shechita of the offspring, they should have been machmir consistently in the Reisha to require kisi adam, and they don't have to be worried about the onlooker, because he'll interpret as if he's cleaning his yard, not that he's doing kisi adam for the sake of the mitzvah, and he's not going to eat the basar. So why weren't the Chachamim consistent and be machmir against Rabbi Meir in the Reisha and require kisi adam? So the Gemara offers an ukimta shachat biashpa mai ikal meimar. There are cases in which once you require kisi adam, it becomes obvious to the eyes of the onlooker that he's fulfilling the mitzvah of kisi adam. He's not cleaning up for hygienic purposes because he's talking about an ashpa. In an ashpa, which is this public garbage dump, nobody cleans it out. Maybe the municipality is in charge once a year, I don't know. Or, for example, the Gemara gives another example. Bali molech ma'ikol meimar. What are you going to tell me if you come in front of the Rav and you ask him, should I do kisi adam? So therefore, the Rabbanan could not require kisi adam because the onlooker will think that it's a valid shechita because the rabbis paskin for him that he has to do kisi adam. So therefore, again, swinging about 180 degrees, we go back and we say that therefore the Rabbanan concede to Rabbi Meir that we cannot obligate kisi adam. The Gemara asks, "V'litaymech seifa nami bal limolech ma'ikol meimar." Wait a minute. In the Sefer, the Rabbanan are machmir against Rabbi Meir, and they say that even though the unsupervised shechita, we're going to say he can't go ahead and shech the offspring on the same day. He's going to come after the shechita, the cheireshot v'kot, and ask, do I have to be machmir and avoid slaughtering the offspring? And they were going to say, yeah, you have to do it. Well, the onlooker is going to say, well, if there was a psak from the Rav that he's got to avoid shechting the vlad, it must mean that the shechita is valid. And this completes the Shaklavitaria. We go back to square one, and we assume now that the Rabbana will be consistent, and to the same extent they argue against Rabbi Meir with regard to the Ptur of Kisei Adam and the Reisha. Then, just like we saw in the Sefer that they were machmir and they prohibited shechting the vlad, they're going to say in the Reisha, we're going to have to require Kisei Adam. El Rabbanan Akula Milsa Pligi, Benatri Leila Rabbi Meir Ad Damasik, Lemilse V'Hodar Pligi. So what happens is that only after a bear completes his presentation, then they got up and they argue. But their argument was not only on the Sefer of Oso Vespino, but also on the Reisha of Kisei Adam. Okay, now we get to the Lumdisha part of today's daf. Bishleim Rabbanan L'chumra. I understand the Rabbanan very well requiring Kisei Adam, requiring Oso Vespino, because we have to be machmir. Maybe the Cheresh Shel Tevakot got it right. Ella Rabbi Meir, my time. What's the underlying reason of Rabbi Meir to completely exempt you from Kisei Adam, and you don't have to worry about Oso Vespino? Why not be machmir? Maybe the Cheresh Shel Tevakot got it right. So the answer of the Gemara, I believe, we'll try to fit it into the words of the Gemara, is that Rabbi Meir doesn't think that there's a chance in a million. It's like throwing a stone, and trying to hit a thing by chance, that the Cheresh Shel Tevakot would have gotten it right. Let's see if we can put that into the language of the Gemara. Om Rabbi Yaakov, Om Rabbi Yochanan, Mechayfai Rabbi Meir al Shchitasa Mishum Nevela. If the Cheresh Shel Tevakot shechted an animal and there was no supervision, and you went ahead and you ate from the basar, Rabbi Meir says you're going to get malchus for eating nevela, assuming you ate a kazayis with asra. So we see 100% that Rabbi Meir is absolutely convinced there's not a chance in a million that the Cheresh Shel Tevakot would have performed the shechita properly. My timer, Rabbi Ami, Hoel v'rov Maseches kol. Again, the rov here means a very stark rov, that he's going to bungle this Cheresh Shel Tevakot, and he's deranged and he's too young. He doesn't know the laws of shechita, and he's going to mess it up. I would differentiate between a Cheresh and a shot on the one hand and a cotton on the other hand, because, a cut might be 12.9, and, next Shabbos is his bar mitzvah, Shabbos Nachamu, and you would think that maybe there's a good chance he would get it right, because if he did the same shechita after Shabbos, if this was his bar mitzvah Shabbos, then he would rely on his shechita. But anyway, Amalei Rav Popular Rav Huna Braid Rav Yoshua my Irya Rov Afilu Mi Nami. You know what? I'm going to tell you that even if, let's say, 20% statistical probability will tell you that the Cheresh Shel Tevakot didn't get it right and he boggled the shechita, he did shehiyah or ikur or whatever he did, that itself would be enough for Rabbi Meir to come to a definite conclusion that the shechita is nevel. It's a non-kosher shechita. And somebody who eats from the boss is going to get malchus. Because Rabbi Meir has a shita called chayshina lemiuta. Let's see how that works. To Rabbi Meir chayish lemiuta, and therefore smoke miuta chazak v'israelei ruba. Every animal that's alive on 4 has a chazak of Ever Menachai. In order to be matir the basar, you need a vadai to remove that chazaka, that status quo of Ever Menachai. And we have a principle called smoch miuta lechazaka. We add A plus B. A is the chazaka, B is the miuta, and both the chazaka and the miuta are attacking the shechita and saying that shechita is invalid. The pella of this Gemara, mamish, is amazing. that these conceptual halachic legal principles will lead you to the conclusion that this was definitely a non-kosher, non-successful shechita. Why? Because the chazak of the status quo, and you're guilty until proven innocent, and add to that 20% of the chereshot v'kotans will not get the shechita right, even though the human mind would say that 80% of the chance that he got the shechita right. And now you're going to go ahead and you're going to give malchus to someone who eats from the basar based on this conceptual approach. Bisnan, how do we know that there's a principle called smoke miyutul chazaka, the Israeli ruba, tinok shenimtza b'tzada isa, ubatzek biyado. Now let's understand. Here, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. It's just the opposite of what we had in Shechita, of Evrim and Achai. Because here, the dough has a cheskas kashrus. Now, the tinok, on the other hand, is considered a source of tumah because he plays around with the shkotzim and everything else. Now, we didn't find that the piece of dough was in the hands of the tinok. If it was in the hands of the tinok, then we know it's tameh, despite the chazak of tar. But the child was next door in close proximity to this dough. Rabbi Meir mitayer, v'chachamim mitameh. Rabbi Meir says, you know what? Although I have to admit that most children will play around with the dough, and if he's standing next to the dough, he probably, it's like these magnetos, he probably had to play with the dough. But 20% chance that he did not have any contact with the dough. Nobody actually testified that we saw him touch the dough and he had it in his hands. And the Chacham mitameh. The Chacham say, you know what? Darko shel tinok chetapeh. We have every reason to assume that if the child is standing next in close proximity to the dough, that he actually came in contact with the dough. But v'amrina my time of the Rabbi Meir, why does Rabbi Meir insist that the dough is still tahar? Because Sava Rov Tinochos V'Tapchim. He admits that in most cases the child will poke around and then come in contact with the Isa, but miut ein mitaf. There's 20% chance that maybe the child did not come in direct contact with the dough. And Isa zubeches kastaro medes. The dough is considered innocent until proven guilty. It has chazaka status quo that it's tar because we know it was tar and we don't know that it became tameh. Is smoke miyutil chazaka v'islei ruba on the top of the pevov base. So here we have a source for this principle of Rabbi Meir that we're choshesh for the miyut. In this case, the miyut works in our favor, telling me that the child maybe did not come in contact, poke around with the dough. Add that mute to the chazaka, and A plus B equals C, and we say that the dough is b'chezka, the isa is b'chezka's tam. And therefore, we're going to apply that principle here in a slightly different way, and we're going to assume that since every animal has a cheskas isur, because behemah b'chayeh b'cheskas isur omedes kos of Evrim and Achai, and therefore the animal is guilty until proven innocent, you want to set up a shechita, well, guess what? 20% of the chereshot v'kotans who perform shechita get it right. Just 1 second. No, I'm sorry. 20% of the chereshot v'kotan will boggle the shechita and it'll be possible. Add the 20% to the cheskas isur of the animal, and we assume that the result of the shechita is that the basar is nevela. Somebody eats a kazayas, he gets malchus, and we're not going to concern ourselves with the 80% probability that the katan did the right shechita. So why then do you have to point out, as we saw on Amud Aleph, that Rabbi Meir is based on the fact that Rov Maseim Mikul Kolim. Forget about Rov Maseim Mikul Kolim. Just Miyud is enough. And the Gemara answers him, Amru Safek Tuma L'Tayir, Yomru Safek Isu L'Hatir. You know what? Rabbi Meir is much more laid back with regard to Tuma and Tara, and he's willing to say, based on this logic of smoke miyuta l'chazaka, that the dough remains in its chezkas Tara. But is Reb Meir going to go ahead to the other extreme and apply this principle to be matir a suffix isur? For example, let's say now we're going to allow, according to Reb Meir, that you shech the offspring on the same day that the cheresh shel tefillah shechted the mother, and you're going to assume that the shechita of the cheresh shel tefillah, because the 20% chance that he boggles it was boggled, and now you're going to allow me to go ahead and shech the offspring. That far Reb Meir is going to go? He's going to take smoch mi utel chazak v'Israel ruba as far as to say it's definite, and now we could be making on this Easter of Osav Espino. How's that possible? I think the Gemara might be also analyzing the case of Kisei Adam and Rabbi Meir, because once again you're being matir bittul essay of Kisei Adam. Now, what we have to add to this discussion here is the Ritva. The Ritva says that the reason why we would be more inclined, or Reb Meir would be more inclined to be Mekil in the case of Tuv V'Tara, is based on a principle called Ein Bo Das Lishoel. Again, this is way beyond our, it's not even in Daf Yomi. I mean, it's mamish, that part of 1/3 of Shas, it's not in Daf Yomi, and that is Taros. And the halacha is that you're only going to be mitame Taros if the person who comes to ask the question, because he got involved in the suffix, is capable of asking the question. That's called Yesh Bo Das Lishal. In our case, we're talking about a Tinok who was involved perhaps in being mitame the dough, and he is Ein Bo Das Lishal. And in such a case, we remain Torah. Okay, now we get to Rebbe. Hora Rebbe Kerebbe, Meva Hora Rebbe Chachamim. We don't know which was the original position of Rebbe and which was his final position, but he changed his mind. At some point, he did paskin like Rebbe Meir, and at other points in his life and his career, Rebbe paskin like Chachamim. Haiminayu Achrita. So one wants to know what was his final conclusion. Toshma, Rabbi Abba, etc., etc. Now, usually when the Chachamim are standing on the entranceway into the Beis Medrash, they will go inside. In this case, they were sort of gathered outside in the Shuk of Caesarea. And why was it important that they enter into the study hall? They may have discussions in halacha, and they want to, go back and forth, shakavatari, outside the study hall, because it could be that inside the Beis Medrash, somebody came in and asked the shaila, and now the Chacham are standing outside the Beis Medrash. They won't be able to be part of giving the answer. Nafak Rabbi Ami Ashkechinu. Rabbi Ami came out. He saw that the Chachamim there were gathered outside the entranceway to the study hall. Amalahu, he said to him, Lav Aminuch, I've told you in many occasions that when there's action going on and learning, and people coming in and out of the base measures, you should be inside. Don't stand on the outside because Dilma Ika Inishtim Itztarcha Lahu Shmaita. Somebody might have a shaila to ask, or he can't figure out the sugya, and you're on the outside. You don't know how to help him because you didn't even hear his shaila. Asila true that. He'll end up being very torud, very confused because he doesn't have access to your scholarship to ask you the question because you're on the outside. So after this Musa Shmuz from Rabbi Ami, then Rabbi Zera took the words of Rabbi Ami to heart, and he went into the study room. He says, I'm out of here. I'm going into Beis Medrash. However, Rabbi Abba lo. Rabbi Abba was, a thinking man on his own. He said, I'm not ready to go into Beis Medrash. I'm having a discussion here on the outside, or maybe I'm buying chumus for Shabbos in the shuk of Caesarea, or they invited me to go swimming in one of those pools over there, or I went to see Netanyahu. Whatever he was doing there in the shuk of Caesarea, I'm not going in. So now, Yasve v'komi boile lahai minayu achrita. While they were all inside, and Rabbi Zera at least went in, Rabbi Abba was still on the outside. So they were trying to figure out what was the final conclusion of Rebbe with regard to the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Chacham. Amalahu Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera said to him, if you don't mind, let's take a break for a second. I'm going to go outside and I'm going to ask this question to Rabbi Abba. Lo shavkisun li d'aishilu l'saba. Apparently, Rabbi Abba was the zakein shebechabura. He was the elder statesman. And not only that, Rabbi Abba was the son of Rabbi Chia. I mean, you're really going back in time here. Dilma Shmiel Leme Avua. It's very possible that Rabbi Abba heard something from his father, Rabbi Chia bar Abba. And not only that, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, the father of Abba, Avua minei de Rabbi Yochanan. Apparently, Abba was the grandson of Rabbi Yochanan, and maybe his father, Rabbi Chia, heard something from Rabbi Yochanan. I mean, you're really going back now. Rabbi Yochanan in the Yerushalmi is like a Tana. Rabbi Chia bar Abba kol tolsin yomen kamahad talmudei kama de Rabbi Yochanan. And if you have any doubt about how Rabbi Abba's father, Rabbi Chia, was close in discussion and understanding Rabbi Yochanan's Torah, I'm going to tell you that every 30 days, Rabbi Chia bar Abba would review all of Shas and Poskim with Rabbi Yochanan. My Havi Allah. So what was the final conclusion? Tashma, the Shalach Rabbi Elazar Legola. Rabbi Elazar sent a message from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel that Hora Rebbe ki Rabbi Meir. That on one occasion, or at one point of his life, Rebbe paskin like Rabbi Meir. And Vaha Kirabonanami, or we know from historical evidence that there were times in Rebbe's career where he paskin like the Rabbanon against Rabbi Meir. Elav Shmamino Dachrisi Shmamino. From the fact that Rabbi Elazar sent a letter to Bavel in which he says Hora Rebbe Rabbi Meir, that must be Rebbe's final conclusion. And this leads us to the Mishnah in the second half of Peivav Amid Beis. What would you say about the following, just intuitively? Can you do one Kisei Adam for many, many shchitos? The Mishnah says, Shochad Mea Chayos b'makom echad. I mean, can you imagine the pool of blood here? He shechted 100 deer. Kisei echad l'kul. It's okay if all the blood is there and he does kisei on all the blood. Mea ofos makom echad, if there are 100 ofos, and he shechted 100 ofos in one place, weiter, kisei echad lekulam. But now what happens if he shechted chayos and he shechted ofos? Do they require two different kisuyim? That's a machlokus in the Mishnah. Tanakama says chayav v'of b'makom echad is kisei echad lekulam. What's the difference with a chayav and oaf? In both cases, the Torah says they're obligated to kisei. Let him do one kisei for all the chayas, all the ofos. One kisei suffices. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no. Shochet chay yichasenu, v'akach yishchot ha'of, and yichasen. You've got to do a separate shchita / kisui for oaf and for chaya. I don't think it makes any difference what sequence, but finish one job and then pick up the other job. Chaya and oaf are two separate entities, what we would call two separate machayvim, and therefore go ahead, shech the chaya, do the kisei adam, then shech the oaf, and do a separate kisei adam. Because oaf and chaya are in two categories. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, and the Brisa now is going to explain that the whole machlokas here about chaya and oaf, whether one kisei suffices for both, is dependent upon drashos about how to turn the psukim. The Torah says, and now we're starting with the shita of the Tanakama, that one kisei is enough. It says chaya kol mashma. It says chaya means no matter how many deer you have. I mean, that's not a subject of this debate. And that means bein meruba, bein mu'et. It's oaf kol mashma. Oaf bein meruba, bein mu'et. Mikana omru shochat mea chayis makom echad kisech lekula, mea ofos makom echad kisech lekula. Now we get to the case which is the subject of the controversy. Chayav v'of b'makom echad nachamo kisui echad lekulam. This is the Tanakama Shita. Now we see it in the Brisa. And then he does a separate shchita plus kisui on the oath. Why? Shenemar chaya o oaf. O is always a machalik, separating the chaya from the oath. Amrulo, the Chacham responded to Rabbi Yehuda's drasha, and they said, Harehu Omer, ki nefesh kol basar domo b'nafsho hu. Look at it, it says kol basar. Kol basar is coming to include both chai v'o. And this is the very next pasuk after chaya o oaf. Again, you're going to have to ask the question, so why did the Torah add the word o? According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's nicha, it's very good because the o comes to tell me that finish the kisei adam job on the oaf and then pick up the kisei adam on the chaya, separate kisei adam. According to Chachamim, since the pasuk after the word o, chaya o oaf says kol basar, it's coming to include both oaf and chaya in the same kisei adam. My kamahadule, what did the Chachamim say? Hachi kamale rabbanan hi o mi boile lechalik. I'm going to use o for a whole different story. Because if it didn't say the word o, and if it would have said chaya ve'of, without the word o in between, we would have said that you're only chaya v'kisi adam if you shech both a chaya and an oaf. So I need the o for a machalik to tell you that if you shechted an oaf, you're chayav in kisui. If you shechted a chaya, you're chayav in kisui. And therefore, I'm going to use the kol basar to assume that one kisui will apply to both oaf and chaya. Rabbi Yehuda lechalek, where's Rabbi Yehuda going to derive the conclusion mechalek? He can't derive from o because he needs o to tell you that you can't do one kisui for both. Is midamo nafka. Damo, according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding, is in the singular. Dam shelo. A dam shelo is either shelo shel chaya or dam shelo shel oaf, but it can't be both at the same time. And Torah is telling you that it, in the singular, needs Kisi Adam. Rabbanan Damo Tuvamash, but they understand that Damo is not referring to the singular, but it's referring to the plural. You have numerous animals with a volume of blood from all these numerous animals that you shechted, and we know that it includes both Chayav Yot Ksiv, Ki Nefesh Kol Basar, Dam V'Nafsho, and Kol Basar includes both Chayav Yot. So all this is a matter of droshos that led to the controversy as to whether or not one Kisei Adam could work for both the Shechita of Chayav Yot. Now the Gemara wants to ask another question. We have a principle in Hilchas Brachos called a hefsek. Like, let's say, for example, you were shechting two animals, one after the other. One bracha would work for both, unless there was a hefsek in between. So now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you shechted a chaya, and then you're going to shecht an oaf. But after you shechted the chaya, you did kisei adam on the chaya. Now you're ready to shecht the oaf. So the kisei adam is a mafsik, because again, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that you can't do kisei adam on both. So you need a separate kisei adam to separate between the first shchita and the second shchita. That kisei adam on the chaya that you shechted first should be a hefsek. And now when you pick up the slaughter's knife and you want to shech the oaf, the second shchita, you should require a new bracha. Model Rabbi Yehuda le'inyan bracha she'einu mevarech al bracha achas. Pili plain. Says Rab Chanina, the kisei adam of the chaya that he shechted first is not a hefsek between the bracha that he made on the shchita of the chaya and the shchita of the oaf. So the bracha that he made on the chaya will be chal even on the oaf. And if not for the fact that there was a hefsek in between, nobody would argue about that. Because whether you shechted a chaya or an oaf, it makes no difference. It's all part of one mitzvah of shechita, as long as there was no hefsek between the two. I don't understand what's going on over here. Maishna mi talmidei de Rav. These students of Rav were sitting together at a Suda. Ka'aili Rav Yeva Sava. Amulei Hav Livrech. So you're in the middle of a meal, or to be more precise, you're at the end of the meal. And somebody says, I have the cup of wine. They pass me the cup of wine. Havla Nevarech. Rabbi said, we'll mention. Is the halacha is Hadar Amalei Hav Lishtei. They made a change in plans, and he says, "Give me a drink of wine. I'm going to drink the wine." And Amalu Rav Yeva Saba Hakim Rav came in the Yom Hav Levarech. Itzar Leila Mishtei Chamra. Havlon Levarech is an indication of Siyum Seuda. You finished your Seuda. You're ready to bench Bezimun. And after the Siyum Seuda, if you want to drink wine, you're in trouble. Because you have to make another bracha. I am tempted to say, I don't want to put my reputation on the line, that Itzar Le Lemishtei Chamer, he doesn't mean it literally that you're not allowed to drink wine. You're allowed to drink wine, but you can't drink wine without a bracha. Now, let's see how Ravina, in his discussion with Rav Ashi, is going to make a parallel to our case, where he shechted a chaya, kisei adam on the chaya, and then he shechted it off. Now we've just finished saying that you don't require another bracha. Hachinami came with the itfa leila kisuye ichayv le bracha. To the same extent that Rabbi Saina Varech is a hefsek, so too kisei adam is a hefsek, because kisei adam is a separate mitzvah. It's not the mitzvah of shchita, and you did shchita on the chaya, you made a bracha on the shchita of the chaya. Now you did another mitzvah you picked up, which is called kisi adam. Now you have a hefsek. It's like havlin levarich and bench. And therefore, chayv bracha. How can you tell me that Rabbi Yehuda agrees that one bracha is enough? And here we'll learn 2 lines on the top of Daf Pei Zayin. Hachi what kind of comparison is that? Hasam mishta ubruche bahadi adadi lo efshar. There's no question about it, says the Gemara, that havlon levarech, which means that you're ready to start benching, that's a hefsek in terms of drinking wine. Because let's say you'd want to recite Birkas Hamazon and drink wine at the same time. I don't think that that's humanly possible. I mean, does anybody have a throat that is wide enough to allow him to speak and at the same time simultaneously drink? So therefore, the benching is definitely antithetical, so to speak, to drinking. And therefore, Birkas Hamazon is a hefsek. But guess what? There's a possibility of doing shchita on the oath, the second shchita, and kisi adam for the chaya, the first shchita, simultaneously. You got to be very ambidextrous for this. But what you're going to do is, with one hand, you're going to shech the oath. With the other hand, you're going to be machasa the dam of the chaya. And that's called efshor de shochit bechada with one hand, umachasi bechada. So therefore, kisi adam and shchita are not mutually exclusive. It's not impossible. Pardon the double negative. It's not impossible to do both at the same time. In fact, it is possible to do both at the same time. I wouldn't recommend it, shchita here and kisi adam there, but they're not antithetical. And therefore, the kisi adam of the chaya is not a hefsek. And this leads us to the mission of shachat v'lo kisa, which is your homework assignment for Shabbos, and that's Pei Zayin. And if it's Hashem v'li neder on Yom Rishon, we do Pei Ches. So that we need a memory device, a mnemonic device for Sunday's daf. And the pach here in Israel is referring to what we call, in New York at least, a garbage pail. A pach. What do you call it in Chicago? You don't call it a garbage pail, do you? Yeah, you do? Oh, okay. I know the Brits have a different, I think even in Canada, I think they have a different word for it. Okay, Rabbosai, Shabbos Nachamu, Nachamu, Nachamu on me. Let's hope for Nechama. And better news. Kol Tuv. Have a great job.